I've been telling you guys to do things by putting a shell on first, and then we're going over that later without, or with the ridge bit. But you do not have to do that. You can simply put ridges on immediately. I have done that with this one here, and these ridges aren't terrible, but the one thing that you might be able to see is that on the bottom right here, the newspaper is kind of poking through where I went through and pushed it on. So I know that the only thing between the center of the pumpkin and that is 4 layers of newspaper. And that's one of the reasons I like to have the shell, is because I know that on all these creases, I've got an extra bit of reinforcement. Whereas if I don't put the shell on, I know that at the bottom of the crease is an incredibly thin section, that if something ever happens, I drop the pumpkin, something drops on a shelf and knocks off the pumpkin, that's a spot where a puncture is more likely to happen. And I just like having a greater shell and layer of extra sturdiness to my pumpkin. The other thing that I like is that right now I still have the beach ball in here. If I have a shell on this, I can pull the beach ball out if I feel like it, and the water that will diffuse from the ridge layer will diffuse into the shell a bit, and then I can have drying from that other side. You can't do that same thing here, because when you put the mass of the ridge material onto this 4 layers of paper, the water will go into the paper, but if you don't have your beach ball inside, the newspaper will soften up so much that the whole thing will start to collapse. So I have to have the beach ball in here if I decide to put my ridges on with no outer shell on top. So against the way I normally like it, but you absolutely can do this. You don't have to put a shell on. I will show you doing it with no shell. And it's pretty much the same thing as the shell, but we're going to put a very thick layer on here, and we're going to put the ridge lines right into this, right on the paper. But I must have my beach ball in there, because if I wanted to get the extra drying effect from having that exposed and having this whole inside open and air blowing in there, this newspaper would get so soggy in the middle stage that it would start to sag down. It wouldn't have enough structural support to enable me to do that. But without further ado, here we go. So right here, I am just smoothing the new section down onto the old section to try to make that as even of a transition as possible. So areas where they join up, you're going to hand smooth that down and in. Okay, I've applied my clay directly to the paper, and we're going to put some grooves in it. But first off, notice that in order to get my grooves in it, I have had to apply, I don't know, maybe a little less than a 1/2 inch, maybe 6 millimeters all the way around. So the clay on here has got to be applied thicker, and that means it's going to take longer to dry. All right, so I've gone down around and through and gotten this pretty well set. The only aspect of the technique is pretty much just taking your butter knife or screwdriver or whatever. If you've got a flat edge that you want, you just press it up against that and give it a little mash down, give it a little push up so it stays as angular as you want it or don't want it. Same thing for the eyes. I was just pushing my little butter knife on there and then just giving it a pat towards it to make sure things are staying angular. Now, I've got some smoothing paste here. I've got my both spatula and a paintbrush, And I'm just going to find those areas, which will be just about the whole thing. And I am going to give it a little dip of smoothing paste. And I'm going to use my spatula to get myself the smoothest surface that I think I can get using this method. Some spots I may swap over to the paintbrush, because I think I can do a little bit better with that. I've got a spot here where this line is going to come up here, so I'll just strip some clay off and then smooth it down so it falls into line with that. But next step, suffice to say, is smoothing. I'll see you when it's set. All right, I've gotten this thing pretty well smoothed out. And now I'm going to put the ridges in it. Just like I did on the back, we're going to take some sort of string. I'm going to use some fishing line, but again, you can use yarn, cord, thread, whatever, just as long as it will hold up for you. Go from the top to the air intake, or from the air intake to the top, doesn't really matter. Just so long as you get a top of the beach ball to bottom of the beach ball line. This again will make sure that you always have these pumpkin-y polar lines perfect. They won't ever take off at weird diagonals for you. Be as many as we want in. There we go. All right. So there are my up-down line guides. I'll take my piece here, which is effectively just a sharpened pencil. You can use something that's like a pen. Anything really, just some pointy little spreader open-y thing. And we're going to expand these lines. Just spread them open. You are pretty much taking them right down to the bottom of the paper. So I've got all my big lines in there. They're all spread open. And now I'm just going to take a paintbrush, give it a dip in my smoothing paste, and I'm going to use the long edge, not the flat edge, so the long edge, to go into the grooves and spread them open a little bit. And then I'm going to use the flat edge on either side to paint it down a little bit. And what we're looking to do here is just separate that groove, seal up any fractious splitting that is occurring in the sides, making them look kind of eh. And then kind of paint the edges down a little bit. So I'm going to spread it open with the long edge, and then with the broad edges, I'm just going to hit the sides and make sure that they are smooth rather than angular. So here is that step. My major grooves are all pretty much established. We're in good shape. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my smoothing clay and hit these areas where I'm meeting the other section, just to get that as absolutely seamless as I can. I may even smooth some sections down by hand if I don't think that the paintbrush is doing a good enough job. But we're going to try to get a seamless blend here. And remember that just because you can really see a blend doesn't mean it's going to be very obvious to somebody just looking, particularly once we start to paint. So that's all set. The major grooves are all in, and now I'm just going to do some minor grooves. For minor grooves, I'm going to take my little pencil tool here, and I'm just going to add a few more lines. But with these, we're not going to have them be major focuses. They're not going to be impacting as much as the deep lines you've already made. How many you do is up to you. All right, now we're going to go over these minor grooves, but we're not going to use the angled edge of the paintbrush to spread them open. We're just going to use the broad edge to give them just a kind of a blend-in paint down. So it doesn't look like they were made by a tool, but that they were grown in just by the pumpkin itself. So I'm just painting down these minor grooves. So there is the major and minor grooves added. And the very last thing I'm going to do is grab my butter knife, and some areas, like the tip of this tooth, just look awful. They've been obliterated completely in there. So I'm going to clean up any spots that I don't like. Just going to push that back together. And up at the top here, I'm just going to make sure things are fairly well blended. I don't really care if things get masked over. Hold on, let's just go a little. Because the top, this whole area should be hidden by the stem. And the bottom would be all masked up by the removal of the beach ball. But that's how you do it without having a shell on there first. It looks not too bad, but you better give it a little extra time to dry. And if you're a person who is excessively worried about mold, be aware that because you're giving this a while to dry and there is a beach ball underneath it, that might be a time when some mold spores may start to germinate. It fundamentally won't matter because we're going to dry this whole thing out no matter what. But if you are worried about mold spores, it's a spot where they can begin to show up. But that is the way I don't like to do it.